Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome all our guests, faculty members, administrative, senior officials, students. I'll relate to you in a minute. Let me introduce myself. I'm Elie Rekhess. I'm the Crown Visiting Professor in Israel Studies and also the head of the Israel Innovation Project. And I have a great honor to open the 7th Symposium on Water in Israel and the Middle East. This year's title is Transboundary Disputes and Collaborative Solutions. Now, this event this year is co-sponsored, co-organized by, first and foremost, the Northwestern Center for Water Research, headed by Professor Aaron Packman, who unfortunately is not well and cannot join us today and tomorrow. And we wish him well, and we wish him quick recovery. So it's the Water Center, it's the Israel Innovation Project, and for the first time, MEF University in Turkey. So this is really an international collaboration, and it is indeed an international conference. We have Professor 𝐒𝐚𝐬𝐬𝐢𝐵 with us from MEF University, who will be speaking tomorrow, and she also wrote the welcome note in the little booklet that you have. It is an international conference in the sense that we have speakers from quite a number of countries, from Israel, from the UK, from France, from Turkey, and from the US. You can look at is there. One quick word about the Russia behind this conference. And what we want to look at is transboundary issues of water in 3 circles. The first circle is the Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian regional geographic one. Second circle is the Tigris and Euphrates basin, which relates to Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And the third circle is the Nile basin, which relates to Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, of course. A special warm welcome to the students who are here. We teach a course, Aaron and I, on water in Israel and in the Middle East. And it so happens that it takes place on Wednesday at 4 p.m. So we have captive audiences here. And thank you for coming. Okay. So I'll just add that the keynote speech will be given today by Professor David Katz. I'll say a word about him later. And the discussion will continue tomorrow morning here starting at 8:30. There'll be breakfast till 1:30, so you're all invited. Again, you can look at the program. But before I allow and invite the dean to come, I have to take 30 seconds of your time, Julio, and thank one person named Crystal Felcaro-Hips, without whom this conference wouldn't have taken place. Crystal, you were and you remain an invaluable asset to all the water activities at Northwestern, and this includes the class, the symposia, the global engineering tracks that are being taken place, and really, I wholeheartedly thank you. So, we are honored to have with us this afternoon the Dean of the Robert McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, Professor Julio Ottino. Very short, brief introduction. We are honored to have him welcome us and welcome the conference. Professor Ottino is the distinguished Robert McCormick Institute Professor. He's also the Walter Murphy Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering and also a professor of mechanical engineering. Longtime friend and supporter of water research and activities at Northwestern, I should say. It was under his initiative, if I may say so, that the Water Center was promoted and established, and various study programs of water in the Middle East, including the global engineering track GET that goes to Israel now for, I don't know, 5th year maybe or so. So thank you, Julio, for all your support, and I call you to say a few words.
Great. Thank you. So first let me tell you how the idea for this started. And I regret again that Aaron could not be here. He got some issues with eyes. And I told that some people came to the rescue, George Wells, Elie, and others to fill the gap. But this is Aaron's baby, and I'm sorry he could not be here. So the idea for this, at some point, obviously before 2016, which was the date of the first of these water symposium, I had a conversation with Lester Crown in my office, and he was also obviously always interested in Jewish causes, and I felt the need of trying to help him in some way, strengthen his footprint in the university, and I couldn't see a point of intersection. But a few days after he left, this was before sustainability was in everybody's lips, okay? I thought, if we want to learn from the best in water, probably we should try to do something with Israel. Bring people here, see what they are doing, maybe expand the circle a little bit. And that was the beginning of the series of things. And then universities are really an interesting, they should be the birthplace of ideas and collaboration, and we have done a lot of that. But sometimes it's hard to collaborate. Just to give you examples of what are barriers to collaboration, for example, we have lots of intersections. We hire people in between computer science and even theater, for example. We can do that. And sometimes you need to tell the person, when the time comes, who do you want to decide your tenure? And people will say, well, I want this department to be the lead and this one to give an advisory vote. And that's good. If you do it within Evanston, you can have people 2/3, 1/3, because there are 3/4 that controls the teaching. Once you move to the medical school or the law school, they have semesters that complicates things a little bit, makes the math more complicated. But just to give you an idea, so I'm telling you this as an example of how things can happen in spite of structures that are complicated. So if we have someone in between, let's say, we don't have anybody, but if we had someone in civil engineering and anthropology, for example, we can say, you tell us who do you want to be the lead department. We get letters for tenure. We may invite someone from anthropology to increase the pool of possible letter writers. And then, let's say civil will decide on this, and anthropology, the department, will get together and say, this is our view of this candidate. This is what, okay, so in theory that works. It doesn't work with the law school. Why not? Because the law school, there are no departments. And you cannot ask an entire school to vote on someone who has like 20%. In spite of that, you can do things. Creating something like this is what has the least degree of complexity, but the point is that this is going to increase in importance in years to come. We were lucky I was one of the people who had the concept for creating 𝐬𝐽, energy and sustainability, and then since we felt like we didn't have enough sustainability, we got lucky. Jennifer Dunn appears in the picture, and faculty find other people, and they found Sarah Young in there, and they do more things. But it's not easy to create things that involve programmatic things, but in spite of that, you can do it. And I'm delighted that this is now part of the established kind of structure of McCormick and the university, and that we have attracted people from other countries to share ideas on how to solve the problem that is going to become more and more and more acute in years to come, okay? At some point, I look at the list of speakers. I wish I could stay for longer here. With these big fluctuations that we have, 1 year you are complete, lakes are drying up in California, then the ice melt, caps are melting, and you have, these things will become more and more and more prevalent as time goes on. We are blessing here by living, I don't know if someone is talking about Chicago and the ability to have a large body of water next to us, but water is going to become one of the most important issues of our times. And by the way, it fits well with what is probably the number 2 issue in the list of strategic objectives for the university. President Schill has made a list. The number 1 is, in no particular order, is everything connected: engineering, medicine, bioengineering. Number 2, sustainability and carbon capture. 3 is a hub for social sciences. And 4th is what? Oh, very imaginative now, data science and AI, okay, everybody. So, but this, my prediction is that this will become more and more important in years to come. So I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm delighted that this has become part of the permanent landscape of Northwestern. Thank you so much.
Remember. Okay. Getting to the. I don't need the microphone. Right?
Thank you. Let me give you the.
Yeah. Crystal said I use it. Okay. Sorry. Before I forget, iPhones, please, if you can turn them off in case you've forgotten to do so, please do so. So we are into our the substantive beginning of our conference with the keynote address, and we are fortunate to have with us Professor David Katz, who surprisingly was born, grew up, not far away from here, West Rogers Park. So this was nice, this was convenient. And so first I have to say a personal thank you to David, who has helped me a lot. By the way, he's from the University of Haifa, and I'll say a word about it. I myself am Haifa born and raised, so we have something in common. And he has helped me a lot in organizing this conference, and I'm grateful to you for that, David. He's a senior lecturer at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University in Haifa. Currently, he is a Israeli Institute visiting scholar at the Nicholas School for Environment at Duke University. His research covers environmental policy and economics with an emphasis on transboundary resources, management of transboundary resources. He also focuses on the interrelationship between economic growth and natural resource use and incentives for conservation. He worked intensively on the international water issues, especially in the Israeli-Arab conflict. So as I said before, he helped us a lot in building the program. So without further ado, I ask you, David, to come over. David will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions, remarks, comments, what have you. So.
Thanks. Don't clap. You don't know if I'm good yet. All right, well, I'll take it because I might not get it at the end. Okay, great. All right. So thank you. Thank you to Elie for inviting me and for giving me this keynote. I'm happy to teach your class for you for a day. So I'm going to talk about one specific element of water resource management in the Middle East that has become sort of a dominant element, at least in the Israeli context, but also in the Gulf area in the last couple of decades, and increasingly throughout the region and the world. And I'm going to talk about how it really changed the way that countries mental way, especially when we're talking about transboundary international water issues. So for those of you who are going to follow quick, this is what I will be talking about. So just very, very briefly going over some of the concepts in transboundary water, and then a little bit about international law, but I'm not a lawyer and don't really understand international law, so I won't go into it in depth. But then talk about specifically how desalination is changing a lot of what's been thought about transboundary water resource management in the past. And then I'll go specifically into the case study of Arab-Israeli relations, and finally end up talking about one specific project that led to an international agreement between Israel and Jordan, something that I was associated with the early stages of. Okay, whoops, I'm going backwards. All right, so just in terms of transboundary waters, what do we mean? We mean a river or a lake or an aquifer, groundwater, that crosses some international border. Now, water is hard enough to manage anyway because it's ubiquitous. It's used for everything, for drinking water, for agriculture, you name it. But when you add in that it crosses international boundaries, it complicates things exponentially. But many, many river basins are international, over 300, over 230 aquifers are, and that covers most of the world's population. Right? So if we look at it on a map, these are international water basins, and as you can see, that's a fair chunk of the world. In fact, it's almost all the countries that aren't island countries, like Australia or Japan, and they don't have borders, land borders. But even if you look at some of the other countries, like the Arabian Peninsula, they don't have surface water. But when you look at this is a map of international aquifers. You can see that they actually do have shared water as well with Yemen and Oman and whatnot. So almost every country will have at least some of their basin as shared water that requires international agreements. A map of some of those agreements. So these are the number of treaties that are formed on different basins in the world. And this is it by continent, if that's of interest. But you can see there's over 450, and that's an outdated number. This is close to 500 now. So we're talking about a lot of work going into managing these transboundary basins. Okay. Most of you students, you've taken a whole course on this, and the rest of you are here because you're interested in water or because you're my... So you probably know a bit about water. It's obviously, it's a critical resource. We need it for everything, even our most basic needs. But it's also, as opposed to energy, it has to be sourced locally. So you can't just have oil tankers shipping it around at the scale that we need it. So it is more of a local basin. It's also a natural endowment, and so there's a question of how you price it. Should people have an access to it? Is it a human right or is it a commodity? It's stochastic, which is, you're at Northwestern, so you use big fancy words to keep up. But stochastic is just another word for uncertain and variable. We don't know how much we're going to get in any given year, right? The Colorado River Basin could be dry this year or it could be overflowing. And that makes it really difficult to plan for. And it moves, which complicates things. You have to manage quality and quantity, right? So it's not enough to say we have this amount of water. What quality is it? What can it be used for? What's the salinity? What nutrients does it have, and et cetera. And especially for transboundary, for international water, there's an issue of, that is, you have an upstream country and you have a downstream country, and the upstream country can influence the downstream country and not vice versa. And so that's, understand relations between countries sharing water, right? So that's much different than, say, two countries that happen to have a lake together. And then finally, not only does it cross boundaries, but often it is the boundary between countries, making it even more difficult to manage when it's the boundary itself, and it moves. So just by a raise of hands, how many of you have been to Liberland? Nobody? Anybody heard of it? No. My favorite story in water resources is this. So it turns out that the border between Serbia and Croatia was defined as a river, the Danube River, and when it was all Yugoslavia, it didn't really matter that much. But then they split up, and they didn't split up amicably. It was not a happy divorce, or I don't know if there's such a thing, but it was not a happy breakup. But the river was then the international boundary. Well, as rivers do, they switched. There was a flood, and the riverbed changed its direction. And so there was a little area here that now was on the Croatian side, but was on the Serbian side, is now on the Croatian side. And so the question was, did the international boundary change? And for various reasons that I won't get into because it's not really related to this talk, neither country wanted it because it would mean accepting all sorts of other boundary adjustments and agreements. And so neither one of them did. And so this guy, who's just a random guy from Czech Republic, said, I'll take it. And he declared himself president of Liberland. He was a libertarian, so he named it Liberland. And he appointed his girlfriend as vice president. And if you want to read about it, it's actually quite amusing. It was a couple of years ago, the BBC article. You can just type in Liberland, and you'll find out about it. And it's just an amusing anecdote, but it sort of highlights how difficult it is to water at an international level. Okay. Like I mentioned, the critical issue here, the role of geography. So Elie mentioned that I'm from the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Haifa. This is not true. You lied. I just found out that I'm no longer in that department. So it was news to me, too. Whoops. I'm part of a School of Environment now. It just changed. Doesn't matter. Okay. But geography is very, very important here. So upstream parties can affect the quantity and the quality of water going downstream, but not vice versa. And so that leaves the downstream parties, obviously there's a strategic advantage for the upstream parties, but it leaves the downstream parties having to look for other mechanisms to influence policy, whether it's military, whether it's economic. It could be collaboration, it could be threats, but they have to seek other non-water related channels to influence. And to quote from a colleague of ours, a friend, Jeroen Warno from the Netherlands, who wrote this in his master's thesis actually, upstream use water to get more power, downstream parties use power to get more water. Okay. So any of you who've taken the international relations course will be familiar with this kind of terminology, realism or internationalism, functionalist idealism, sometimes it's called, different schools of thought. But traditionally, water has been treated as a zero-sum game, meaning it's win-lose. One party takes it, the other party doesn't have it. And sort of the realist school, they gave themselves the name, says it's a limited resource, there's not enough for everybody, so it's likely to lead to conflicts. The sort of idealist or functionalist school says the same thing, the same assumptions. It's a limited resource, there's not enough for everybody, they're interdependent, so it may actually cause people to cooperate. There's an incentive for cooperation here. And then the sort of an economic or economist and engineer kind of approach that says limited resource, not enough, countries interdependent, okay, it's going to induce more efficiency, more innovation in technologies, and that's going to lead to reduced scarcity and then reduced dependency. And these are all sort of competing, and everybody has anecdotal data to support their view of why this should be. And we won't get into sort of what's more dominant, but lots of people will provide anecdotal evidence. So this is all from BBC, how water shortages are brewing wars, and deadly protests in Iran over water, and deadly fighting between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and on. And there's no shortage of these kind of examples of conflict over water. On the other hand, a team by Aaron Wolf, who's sort of the godfather of some of this quantitative studying or cataloging of transboundary water data, and is a friend of mine from way back, and from when he was a grad student, from here at the University of Wisconsin. He developed an indicator measured when was there all-out war over water. Well, never, not for the last 4,000 years or so. And he has this scale of more conflict and more cooperation. And one of his graduate students, Shira Yaffe, published this with a couple of colleagues, with Aaron and a couple of others, as her dissertation, and found overwhelmingly there's a lot more cooperation than there is conflict. And most of the conflict is not severe. It's writing nasty notes, it's complaining, it's that kind of level of conflict. Only a very small amount of the conflict gets to the level of skirmishes, of violence. And most of that was in the Middle East, by chance. Okay. But this, so a lot of people said, well, all of this is hyperbole about the water wars and all this. Even though it occurs, it's not that common. But first of all, the absence of conflict, a lot of people have mentioned the absence of conflict doesn't mean cooperation. So it could be that there's not conflict just because one party is very, very dominant, and no other party would dare to challenge them. So think of China on the Mekong Basin. You know, Laos has no real option to do anything about China. And also, cooperation and conflict often coexist. So if I said, 30 days this month, nobody punched me in the face, only one day, so the preponderance of evidence says that I'm safe. But if I got punched one day in the face, that's enough to, I don't really care about the distribution, I care about these events and that they occur. And so people said, don't think of this as some kind of spectrum or either or binary. They happen both, and you have to sort of evaluate them sort of separately. The one thing that most people agreed on, though, whatever school they're from, whether they're from the realist or the idealist or the others, is that the main drivers tend to be scarcity and the variability, the uncertainty, stochasticity in the water supply. Regardless of what they think the end result will be, these are the main drivers. And that's where we come in remember these, we'll get back to these, because desalination really changes all of these. Okay, international water law, I don't put a lot of credence in it. I don't think that it's very, very implementable, but it does come up with some basic principles. And the basic ones are neither the upstream country or the downstream country has the exclusive rights. So, well, it falls here, I can do with it whatever I want. And a downstream country can't say, hey, you're not allowed to touch it, you have to let it flow freely to us. So if not, then how do you divvy it up? And they came up with these two principles. One is called equitable and reasonable apportionment, which is sort of very vague. Almost every word here is vague. And the other one is no significant harm, right? So this says everybody gets a share, and this one says, but not to the point where it hurts somebody else. But that word significant is really sort of wishy-washy, and even harm, how do you define harm? So they have these basic principles, but they're very, very difficult to implement. And they come up with a whole bunch of criteria for how you would apportion it between historical use and geographical issues. So how much does each country contribute to the flow, and how much of the basin, and access to other waters, demography, how many people are dependent on it, economics, how much support their economy, et cetera, et cetera. Only very lately they add on environment. Unlike, say, coal in the ground, whatever, water, if you don't use it, it still has a very important role. Right? It supports ecosystems, it supports rivers and lakes and whatnot. Okay. So again, these are the sort of critical issues, the geography, the scarcity, the variability. And desalination is really sort of upending our basic assumptions about all of these. And I'll show here in examples that it's really changing also how parties negotiate and whether they cooperate and how they cooperate over shared resources. So this is from the New York Times, and if it's from the New York Times, you know it's true, because they got all the news that's fit to print. So a quarter of humanity facing human water crises, and they have a measure here of water stress, and we won't get into how they measure it, but we'll just take it as the word of God, that this is how you measure water stress. It's not, it's the word of a researcher from Sweden, but we'll get into that later. And this is the map in a couple of years ago, and this is the map in 2040, and you can see it's growing significantly, especially in the Middle East region. Okay. A little bit about desalination. I'm sure you all know it's taking water, salt water, the salt, making it into fresh water that's usable for potable purposes and for industrial purposes. And you can see it's sort of exponential growth, especially since the 2000s, really just taking off. And it was once sort of restricted to the rich countries of the Middle East, the countries who had more oil than they knew what to do with, and lots of cheap energy. But now it's being used in over 150 countries as the technology becomes more efficient. Okay, we won't go into this. But these are all sort of graphs showing costs and exponential increase in desalination plants. And this is showing where they are around the world. And you can see it's a fair chunk of the coastal areas of the world. And so while it used to be considered the luxury of really rich countries, rich countries. Okay, still a preponderance of the desalination capacity is in the Middle East region. In Israel, over 80% of municipal supplies are now supplied by desalination. The projections are that by 2040, maybe 2050, Israel will actually have water, the primary of water in the region. Do you think that this is just rich water supplies in Africa and other places? Okay, so getting back to transboundary international water. So what does it mean for international water? Well, it's no longer scarce, right? If you have the money for it, you can almost have endless supplies. So it's gone from being a fixed resource, a fixed pie that you have to divvy up between countries, to we get to decide how big the pie is. Uncertainty, right? That was one of the other drivers. Right? Well, now we have a lot more certainty about how much, about the quality, about the location, about the timing, perhaps about the price. The drivers, that it's fundamentally changed how we think about things. The geography. Upstream parties, we said, have the advantage. Right? Think of Turkey, think of China, upstream on these big rivers. But desalination tends to take place along the sea, and that tends to be where the downstream parties are. And so it gives additional leverage to downstream parties. And ownership. So water is right? It's from the heavens. It's from God. It's a natural endowment. But it's more like a manufactured good. Right? You can just produce it if you have the technology. So it fundamentally changes the way we think about water rights. Okay. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and say that it really changes how countries are negotiating now over water. So it offers states more flexibility, and I'll give a couple of examples in terms of when they cooperate, how they cooperate, strategies. So there's something in national bargaining, or in all bargaining actually, called BATNA, the best available to negotiated agreement. Best available, I forget what the T is. Anybody remember? Best available, what's that? Best alternative to Best alternative to negotiated agreement, right? So it's really changing what the alternatives are now, since you now have a viable option for downstream parties. And that really changes the incentives for parties to either cooperate or to go it alone. And it expands the sort of set of available options that parties can put forward. And there's a big rethinking of some of the legal principles addressing transboundary water sharing. Okay, just for example, opportunity for cooperation and new ways to cooperate. So this is the Colorado River Basin. As we know from the last years, the big water scarcity issues here. According to the treaty from 1944, the Mexicans have to, the Americans have to. There's not enough water in the river to do so. And now with minutes 319 and 323, which are just amendments or updates of the treaty, they've talked about, well, maybe we can use desalination to allow us to meet our agreement. So if the water quality is not good enough in Arizona, maybe we desalinate it so we can get enough good water to Mexico. Or the Americans pay for a desalination plant in Mexico. Instead of worrying about water coming from the river, why don't we build them a desalination plant to fulfill our agreement? So it's giving different options for cooperation for meeting these kind of challenges, especially with climate change coming on. But it doesn't always go that smoothly, right? So it could be that it allows for more cooperation. It could be it allows for less cooperation. So this is the example of Singapore and Malaysia. For years, Singapore was dependent on Malaysia for its water supply. Very densely populated, doesn't have a lot of its own. It's very much at the mercy of Malaysia, and Malaysia knew it. All sorts of quotes of the Prime Minister of Malaysia saying we got them where we want them, extracting from them all sorts of compromises, trade agreements, economic support, what have you. In the 1960s, they signed a 50-year agreement. That agreement expired in 2011, and when the Singaporeans to renegotiate, the Malaysians still thought they had all the cards, and the Singaporeans said, no, we're not going to do it. And they decided to invest in desalination instead. They had a better alternative to a negotiated agreement, and they let this expire. So this wasn't renewed because they weren't willing to pay the price of the upstream party. This, maybe Kevin will talk about this tomorrow, maybe not, but in the Nile Basin, Egypt is very worried about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a huge dam being built on the Nile, which will alter the flow, at least, if not the quantities, the timing of the flows. And when they realized they couldn't stop the Ethiopians, they started investing in desalination plants downstream. So, again, alternative to a negotiated agreement. Sometimes you don't even need to build the desalination plants to impact. A colleague in London School of Economics, Michael Mason, has written Northern Cyprus, so Northern Cyprus. Turkey, of the Turkish population here, they didn't have and they were actually talking about developing jointly or purchasing from the Republic of Cyprus, which is the Greek part here, water resources. Wait a minute, we don't want that. And they built a huge pipeline between Turkey and northern Cyprus to supply them with water. So just having the option of desalination can change water relations without even having to build it. Okay, all that's good, but you're saying about the Middle East and Israel, and you haven't talked about that, so now I will. Just so we understand what we're talking about in terms of size, just to put it in context. So this is the area in square kilometers, which means nothing to most people in America, but even if it was in miles, it wouldn't mean anything to anybody. So, so this is, I didn't bother to, because it wouldn't make a bit of difference. Just showing you the relative size, square kilometers of Israel, Lebanon, West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jordan. Okay, so we have that. This is our map. And just to put it in context, this is the size of Illinois. Much bigger than all of this, than 4 countries, if you consider West Bank and Gaza as Palestine as a country. So much bigger than all of those, right? Israel itself, right? Israel, the West Bank, Gaza comfortably fit in the Lake Michigan. So by the way, I hope you, I took a lot of from different talks that I prepared. The one thing that I did to make it look nice is I made this purple. I don't know if you appreciate that. It took me like 10 minutes just to make that little banner purple for Northwestern. You can thank me later. Okay, so one of the other things you have to know about the region is it's very, very densely populated. By the way, when we look at this area, just to understand the distances here, from the sea to the West Bank here, anyone want to guess what the distance there, the shortest distance from the sea to the West Bank? 9 miles. Yeah, about 15 kilometers or so. So very, very short. You guys are young. You could probably run that. I can't. But very, very short. So we're looking at a very sort of long, narrow country here, very densely populated. This is where people live. This whole area is desert, so you can see very, very densely populated. Israel is the most densely populated OECD country, so a rich nation country. The West Bank is very, very densely populated as well. Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. I think second or only behind either Hong Kong or Singapore or something. And in Jordan as well. Jordan has 10 million people, but they're sort of all crammed into this Jordan Valley and Amman region. This is all desert. So you're looking at a very small place, very densely populated, but with a lot of desert area. So all this area where people aren't is mostly desert. Okay. Water, just really brief on water in the Middle East. Water has been sort of crucial into of the country. This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement line. This is how the French and British decided to divvy up the Middle East between them after World War I. And what they did was just draw a straight line on a map like colonial powers like to do. and sort of cut off all the water supplies from where people are and divided it between the different countries, making it really hard to manage. In the end, they changed the border, adjusted it so that the headwaters of the Jordan were actually in the British side, as well as the Sea of Galilee was all on the British side. And these eventually becomes the border of the state of Israel. So it was, water played a critical role in that. And you can see sort of some of the main tributaries, the 𝐒𝐲𝐻𝑒𝐻𝑒, which actually starts in Lebanon, the Banyas, which starts in the Golan, and the Dan, which starts in Israel right here, what's called the Finger of the Elie. Okay, this is a map of the aquifers in the region. This is from a U.S. Report that had, without the borders between Israel, Palestinian Authority, and Jordan, just showing you the watersheds. So you can see that this crosses, between the coastal one crosses between Israel and Gaza. The mountain aquifers cross between Israel and the West Bank, etc. These are all sort of transboundary basins, these aquifers. These are the surface water, these are the aquifers. This is a satellite map. You can see sort of desert. So I mentioned before water stress. So there's a famous index called the 𝐶alkensmark Index. Malin Falkenmark was the Swede that I mentioned. She came up with a sort of rule of thumb for what is scarcity or water stress at a national level, right? And you can always pick, nitpick and criticize any kind of index, but this is just a rule of thumb that's been widely adopted. It's by UN and other organizations, and was the source of that New York Times map that we saw earlier. So less than 1,700 meters per capita per year. A cubic meter here is 1,000 liters. So think of one block of water, meter by meter by meter, 1,000 liters of water per capita per year, and that's for all purposes. So for agriculture, for industry, and whatnot. That's water stressed. Less than 1,000 is water scarce. Less than 500 is acute or chronic water scarcity. So keep that in mind. And this is the countries of the Middle East. So Israel, if you just look at the fresh water, this is, by the way, out of date. Israel now has 1 million more people because it has high population growth rate. So it's now at 10 million, but this is from 2020. If you look at its water resources and divide it by the population, you're looking at well below the standard of chronic acute water scarcity. But Israel has desalination, so wastewater reuse, and it's a leader in water resources. And then people wrote that it's solved crisis and whatnot. And so, okay, add it, and you're up to half of acute water scarcity. So you're still dealing with much less than what's considered acute water scarcity. And that's the best case scenario in the region. If you look at Jordan, Jordan sort of doesn't have great population statistics, so it has what it calls its citizens and guests, because if you call them refugees, then it's a legal status issue. But other residents that still need water, you're looking at 10, 11 million people, and you're looking at even harsher water scarcity, and they don't have desalination now. Palestine, even worse, especially when you're looking at Gaza Strip. Very much water scarce, and this doesn't tell anything about water quality. 90-some% of the water in the Gaza Strip's not of drinking water quality, so it's even worse than this makes it. And even countries that used to have water, like Lebanon, are now approaching, because of population growth, because of influx of refugees and whatnot. Okay, so that's the situation. Like I said, Israel invested heavily in desalination over the last couple of years, a couple of decades. Water was crucial in relations between the parties, seen as a zero-sum game, always hotly contested. The very first act of the PLO as an organization was an attempt to bomb Israel's national water carrier, its main artery water delivery system from the Sea of Galilee to the rest of the country. There was an Arab diversion project. I mentioned the three tributaries of the Jordan River. So the Arab League began to divert them away from Israel, to prevent Israelis using having their took the banyas and they took it to the. They were trying to take the banyas away and divert it, take from the Golan Heights, Dani, and divert it from the Chatzbani in Lebanon, and leave Israel with the Don. And Israel said, "You do that, and it's an act of war." And they actually bombed the diversion efforts. And many people said that was one of the issues that led to the 1967 war, to the Six-Day War. Though there were lots of other reasons. Controls the West Bank and the Golan, and basically headwaters of the aquifer, the Jordan River, and really makes it sort of the water power of the region. In the 90s, when they were talking, the Palestinians, the Syrians, peace agreements, water was consistently by both sides, for compromise or for not compromising, for special negotiation track in the peace talks. So they had the really complicated issues: Jerusalem, refugees, borders. Water was one of those set aside as a special negotiation since it was so complicated. They did talk, though, about the need for joint development of desalination. This is before the drastic decreases in cost, but they were already seeing it on the horizon. Both Israel and Palestine actually didn't want to desalination. Why? One of the reasons is if we desalinate, then the other side is going to say, well, we want more of the natural water. You guys don't need desalinating, right? And so Israel didn't want to do it, but eventually, after many years of extended drought, they decided to do it. The Palestinian Authority, for many more years, said, well, see, now you have desalination. Give us more of the natural water. Deserve it anyway, but we only deserve it now because you have desalination and we don't. Eventually, they stopped doing that, and I asked one of the Palestinian negotiating team, why did you stop that and suddenly come out and say, we want desalination in Gaza? And his answer was depressing. It was, yeah, it was going to hurt us in negotiations, but we've given up negotiations. We can't hold out for negotiations anymore. And so we have to, how am I doing on time? Okay. All right. So the Palestinian Authority eventually gives up on negotiations and is now trying to pursue desalination in the Gaza Strip as well. And we'll talk about why that hasn't moved forward. Okay. Desalination, international water law. Water law has nothing to say about it. It's too new, I guess, of a technology. It hasn't agreement about how it's treated like natural water. Does it affect rights to natural water? Some of the criteria are access to other sources of water. Whoops. Well, does desalination count as access to another source? If one party is along the sea and another party is not, should that influence how you allocate water? The international law hasn't said anything about this. However, if you do build desalination, and that does affect your rights to build a desalination plant, if it means the other side rights to water. So it's a really difficult sort of issue to try and tackle. And international law hasn't really done a good job of doing so yet. It hasn't sort of caught up to the realities. Okay, how has desalination impacted the region? Like Israel eventually says we're going to build desalination, and it's now completely dependent on desalination. It's its only option for water supply for its country, for its growing population, and for climate change. So it's its main sort of climate change adaptation mechanism is just building more desalination plants. It's changed relations in different ways with different parties. So it's resulted in more negotiations and more agreements with Jordan, but less with the Palestinians. And this is I wrote a paper several years ago with a former diplomat, Ram Aviram, in a journal that we have the editor of here, one of the editors of here, Jonathan. And we said in this paper, who will be talking tomorrow, Jonathan Chenoweth, we said in this paper, we don't know a priori if desalination will result in more cooperation or less. It might result in more cooperation because it's less scarcity, it's less variable, there's less reason to fight over it. So it should reduce conflict, but whether it results in more cooperation or just each party going it alone and saying, I don't have to engage with you anymore, like Singapore and Malaysia, we don't know. So with Jordan, it actually resulted in more cooperation, but with the Palestinians, not. And one of the main reasons for this is water. With the peace with the Palestinians, peace agreement only meant to be a 5-year interim agreement, and so the water rights issue an open sore between the parties, and so with Jordan, there's all sorts of issues of, okay, well, you want water, we're willing to sell you water, and we'll desalinate it to you, and all sorts of agreements have been come up with, and we'll talk about a couple of them. But with the Palestinians said, well, why should we have to buy water if it's our right for the natural waters? And so you haven't seen the sort of this kind of cooperation like you have between Israel and Jordan. So I'll talk about a couple of these plans between Israel and Jordan. Israel has constantly said, well, we'll sell water to the PA Authority. But again, Palestinian Authority has become more dependent on dependent. We want shares of our share of the natural. The Palestinians said, okay, that's not happening. We're going to develop our own desalination plant in Gaza. That's their one access to the sea. The international community said, we'll fund it. Right? It's really expensive to do so. But the international community has actually come up and said, we'll fund it. But it hasn't gone through for security reasons. In order to have desalination, you need energy, you need steel, you need cement, you need all sorts of materials that Israel says, well, they could use for a desalination plant, but they could also be used for building a missile factory or military purposes. And so this whole issue of tracking the materials and ensuring they actually go for a desalination plant has been a real sticking point for the parties. Another concern is financial viability. So it's really expensive to desalinate water. And the international community said, we'll pay for the plant, which is a huge expense. But there's also high expenses and energy, and you need a constant energy supply. Already doesn't always have. And so these issues about the financial and technical viability are also sticking points. Hasn't moved forward. For several years, it's sort of just stuck and stagnant. Okay, innovative water sharing agreements, and that was the title of the talk, and I'm finally getting around to talking about it. So this is a picture of Israeli, Jordanian, Palestinian water ministers or infrastructure ministers reaching an agreement with the World Bank sign in the background on this project called the Red Dead Canal. So Jordan has severe water, already overusing its water resources. Its only access to the sea is here at the Red Sea down here at the bottom. There's an idea, the Dead Sea, lowest place on Earth, constantly breaking its record as the lowest place on Earth, dropping by over 1 meter a year because all of the water upstream is being used and no longer reaches the Dead Sea, also because of mineral factories here. But there's a plan to link these seas. So normally when you desalinate water, you push it through jam it through a filter, and you get 2 streams of water, roughly equal. One is fresh water, the other is salt water that's basically double as salty, and normally that just goes right back into the sea. The idea here is take it from here, and instead of dumping it back into the Red Sea, which is coral reefs and a small area, take it and pump it and put it in the Dead Sea to sort of try and stabilize the level of the Dead Sea. And this was it was marketed as a peace canal by the Israeli Shimon Peres, who was talking about a new Middle East in the 1990s. There was a feasibility study, and they said, well, it doesn't really make economic sense, but the countries want it, so and it's technically feasible. But it means taking water and pumping it very, very far, because this is, again, where everybody lives in Jordan. So, and this is up in the hills. This is 1,000 meters above sea level. So it's taking water very far and then having to pump uphill. So this was on the table for many, many years. It didn't go forward for various reasons: cost, environmental concerns, and eventually Israel's government relations deteriorated with Jordan. Let's just talk about this before. I don't want to get caught without any time here. How am I doing? Okay. So an organization called, which is a transboundary or international, Middle Eastern, whatever, Israeli-Palestinian, Jordanian environmental organization, came up with this idea that, you know what, Israel's really densely populated, but Jordan's not, and it has a lot of desert areas that are great for solar energy. It really makes a lot more sense. Israel's great at desalination, and if you look at the map of this Red Dead Canal, this is where people live in Amman. This is the Jordan River and where they get the water up here. You could just build a desalination plant here and go straight there, and it would shorten the distance. It would make economic sense. It would be much more efficient. This whole thing. Jordan wasn't in favor of it because Jordan, like most countries, didn't want to become more dependent on Israel. They wanted sort of their own water supply that they could control. But this organization, 𝐒𝐞𝐈, comes up with this idea that, well, Israel could sell Jordan seawater, desalinated water, and Jordan could sell Israel solar energy, which they do very cheaply and very well. And then it's no longer Jordan having to worry about being completely dependent on Israel because it's a mutual dependency, interdependency. The sort of lovey-dovey, handshakey, a new Middle East kind of thing. This is their logo. It's two palm trees shaking hands, which I helped design. I worked there for many years, about 20-some years ago, and they've gotten rid of it, and I'm very bitter about it. But I still like that logo. So anyway, so they had this idea, and they decided to do what they called a pre-feasibility study. Let's see if it's even technically and economically makes sense. And they hired me as a consultant to lead the study, and I did it with a postdoc and with some other colleagues. And it makes economic sense. It makes technically it's viable. It makes economic sense. It makes a lot of environmental sense. The issue was the geopolitics. Would Jordan buy into it? Since there's a mutual dependency, but you can store electricity much easier than you can go longer with being from electricity supplies than you can without water. Anyway, we did the study. This was back in 2017. Whoops. 𝐒𝐞𝐈 promoted it. It gets a lot of good press. The Europeans, you have to know, they love any Arab-Israeli cooperation stuff. And if you add in sustainability, then you get a... So it wins this prize. The New York Times, Thomas Friedman, columnist, loves the idea and writes glowing about it. Thomas Friedman, so nobody in the Middle East actually listens to him. It's presented at the UN Security Council. This was funded with German money, the project was. And the Germans were head of the Security Council, and they invite the Palestinian, Israeli, and Jordanian directors to present the project at the UN Security. And it gets a lot of attention, but it doesn't in the region. Nobody in the region is really talking about it, and it's not moving. And I get a couple of academic publications out of it, so I'm okay. That's right. I'm an academic. That's what we care about. But I don't actually think it's going to move forward. In fact, Jonathan, at a course we did in Haifa a few years back, actually said, I think some form of this is going to actually come to fruition. I was like, ooh, he's actually more positive about the project than I am, and I did it. I thought, okay, I've done plenty of projects at 𝐒𝐞𝐈. I worked there for many years and worked as a consultant with them for many years, and most of them never come to anything. And I was, okay, this is another one that was a great idea that won't because of the politics of the region. And then last year, the governments actually signed this agreement to swap solar energy and water. First time in my life anything's actually relevant that I do. Most of the credit goes to the organization for promoting it, not for the academic who does the feasibility study. And why? Why suddenly, after years of it being around, years later, did the governments take us up on it? What changed? So it was a bunch of factors that came together all at once. One is the government of Israel changed. So relations with Jordan had deteriorated quite a bit under the previous Netanyahu administration. And an administration led by Naftali Bennett came in. And one of their main interests with vis-a-vis Jordan was improving relations. And they were looking for some projects to work on with Jordan to build relations. And Jordan was desperate for water. The other is the Abraham Accords. So Israel signs peace agreements with the United Arab Emirates and some other countries in the region. And the United Arab Emirates is very, very interested in promoting a regional project. When we did we were including Palestine as part of one of the partners. They weren't part of this agreement. It was UAE sponsored. You can see their flag. But the Palestinians were upset with the UAE for signing a peace agreement with Israel. So they were not part of this agreement. But the United Arab Emirates was very much interested in promoting this kind of regional cooperation on an environmental issue, which is relatively non-controversial or less controversial. And there was the climate change negotiation, Glasgow, a year and a half ago. And the countries needed to show something. They needed to show that they were doing something to meet their own national goals of reducing carbon emissions. And so, and Jordan was just desperate for a water supply because the Red Dead wasn't moving forward, the Red Dead Canal project. And so all of these sort of came together, and the countries said, wait a minute, there's this sort of plan laying around on a shelf somewhere. Let's move forward with this. So it was sort of, it had been around for a while, but it was really this sort of change in the political constellation that led to it being taken up and adopted. Okay. How much, do I have any more time?
You can take definitely.
So I'm going to take 2 more minutes. So I've been talking about 5 more minutes. Okay, I'm going to take 5. I've been talking about how desalination is changed things, mostly for the better, but not always. So downsides to desalination. Like I said, it can be expected to reduce tension. In our first article, we said, you know what? We don't know if it's going to promote cooperation or not, because you could go it alone or you could cooperate, but definitely it should reduce conflict. And then I wrote another article just a couple of years ago sort of debunking that. And again, I lay the blame for the fault of the first article, not with me, the author, but with the editor of the journal for not reviewing it adequately. So that's on you, Jonathan. That was your job. I'm sorry, that's why you have editors. Anyway, so when we started looking really at how relations over water resources, desalinated water, we realized that there actually are instances when it increases conflict. So there's a lot of critique about desalination that we won't get into, that it's expensive, that there's environmental impacts, that it avoids dealing with more basic issues should be sort of dealt with first, structural issues. But those are true of lots of big infrastructure projects, dams and pipelines. What's unique about desalination, the sort of new conflicts that it's raising, some of them anyway. One is what I'm calling the freshwater marine water nexus. For lack of a better word, is fresh water affects marine water quality. We know that rivers dump water into the marine environment. You have these dead zones and whatnot. But we know the way going around. Marine water quality can now affect our fresh water supplies. So this is a remote And this is coming from Gaza. So Gaza didn't have proper sewage facilities, and the Israeli government was like, well, it was a right-wing government, said, you know what, that's their problem, they have to deal with it. But their way of dealing with it was dumping it into the sea. Well, it doesn't stay still, and the sewage plumes moved to Ashkelon, a town a few kilometers away from Gaza, where there's a large desalination plant. And they actually had to shut down the desalination plant times in 2016, 2017. And suddenly, none other than Bibi Netanyahu is saying, you know what, sewage in Gaza is a national security issue for Israel, something that it was never looking at before. And so now that there can be conflict about the marine environment because it's now a source of fresh water. Another issue that I noticed in reviewing sort of negotiations, I was working with some Palestinian colleagues, including the minister that was in the World Bank, and they were talking about this reservoir. This is a beautiful area along the Dead Sea called En Feshcha in the West Bank, and it's a saltwater marsh. Beautiful. It's a nature reserve not far from Jericho. Because it's a salt, nobody's actually, right? But now, actually, it's a potential source of drinking water for Jericho, for Bethlehem, around there. Desalinated, actually desalinated at a fraction of the cost of desalinating seawater, because it's salt water, but it's not as salt as seawater. And it's water that the Palestinians were interested in using. And so now, and the Israelis wanted to keep it as a nature reserve. And so now you have these marginal sources of water, which were an issue for negotiations, or nobody wanted them. Nobody's fighting for them. They're economic as a source of fresh water. And so you are seeing more conflicts. And this will continue to become, as there's more increasing complexity, and you need to turn to these marginal sources, this will increasingly become a source of conflict. So it's not all rosy in terms of desalination. Okay, so I'll finish just, for those of you who are already asleep, by just sort of summarizing. Wake up, this is the end. So what you just missed is saying that desalination is really changed the area's water supplies, but also the relations between countries, how they negotiate, what they negotiate over. In general, I think it reduce conflict between countries, but that doesn't mean there will be more cooperation. It might mean more disengagement, more going at it alone, lateral policies. International law needs to catch up and give guidance on these issues, because it's way behind the times. All in all, though, it is fundamentally changing how we think things work. I think for better, but you can't see it as a silver bullet or a tech. So thanks. Okay, so we got a hand up from Julia.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. If you allow me, I would like to challenge you on a few points.
No, then no. Then I won't allow you.
One suggestion, if the speakers can identify themselves.
Hi, okay, I'm Julie Trottier. I've been working on Israeli-Palestinian water for 28 years. And I really liked your talk. Thank you very much. But I think I'll do my job as an academic, and I'd like to challenge you on a few points. I'm really curious to hear you. With my master's students, we worked on desalination over many different countries. Master's students at Sciences Po Paris, Paris School of International Affairs. And what came out of this research is the crucial role of pension funds in the fact that...
Of?
Pension funds.
Pension funds?
In the fact that desalination is taking over the world. Actually, it is driven, completely driven by pension funds, because it's the best investment for a pension fund. It's a very stable investment. In most countries in the world, the capital funds and the operating costs will be paid through the water bill that every citizen has to pay. And that is the last bill you will not pay in any family in the world. So it's a totally sure investment. It's risk-free. And they know exactly how much they can expect for profitability. And when I looked at what you said about Egypt, it's very clear in Egypt that these desalination plants have been built for the profitability of pension funds. There's a desalination plant in London, and it's only used at 5% capacity, because if you don't use it at all, then the filters will break down. So it's profitable for the pension fund that invested in it. It's not profitable for the citizens or for the environment. So I was wondering if you could investigate concerning the role of pension funds in the fact desalination took over in Israel.
Yeah, I can't, because I don't know specifically about the role of pension funds. But yeah, first of all, I agree. It's become an economic issue. Desalination is sort of a de facto privatization of water, because they're almost always built by private industry. And so normally we think of water as...
It was built by a French company, the Ashkelon plant.
Yeah.
And then Israel took that technology, repeated it in its other plants, and then filled airplanes of Israeli engineers going to California to sell that technology to California and all over the world.
Yeah, Veolia and Suez, and then lots
Absolutely.
of these big French companies. So it's your fault.
No, they only built one. You built the rest. You
No,
took that technology,
in
you built the
Israel,
rest.
but all over the world they're building. So
now,
blame the French.
Also, you did mention that there's a carbon footprint for that water.
Yes.
So basically, Israel has substituted vulnerability towards the fluctuation of rainfall to a vulnerability towards the fluctuation of energy prices. I remember back a few years ago, Alan Tal took all of his students from the Arava Institute of Environmental Studies to meet the then Minister of Water and Energy of Israel, and I accompanied the group. So I asked the minister, but how are you going to pay? How are you going to face that new vulnerability towards energy prices? His answer was, okay, he was a provocative character, but his answer was, it's okay, we have 50 years of gas offshore, so we have the energy. And so I asked him, what are you going to do in the 51st year? And he said, oh, Israel won't exist in 51 years.
Might not exist.
If that's long-term environmental sustainability management, I think, I have doubts. So what is Israel going to do after it runs out of gas?
Right, so lots of folks, Joe Williams and his former supervisor, have talked about this swapping swapping water insecurity for energy insecurity, right? That's along the lines of what you're saying is, yeah, okay, we've dealt with our immediate water issue, but by exacerbating energy issues. And it's sort of ironic that their main climate adaptation policy is something that's actually increasing climate change by being energy intensive, right? And it is, as we said, it's a privatization. There actually in Israel, the company that was running the Ashkelon plant was cheating. It knew exactly when it was being timed to the water quality, and it was only desalinating to a certain level at those times, and then the salinity level would spike. And they, for instance, on Saturdays, on Shabbat, when they weren't being tested, they didn't bother desalinating at the lower level because of the price incentives. This is a clear issue with privatization of a water resource, and it's dangerous and needs to be regulated. It shouldn't be your first option; it should be your last option. Right? Egypt desalinating is somewhat crazy, especially given the affordability issues there. And in most cases, London not using it. Australia built desalination plants, never used them. Yuma, Arizona, for meeting the agreement with Mexico, they built a desalination plant, never used it. It's more of an insurance policy, and it's quite an expensive one. And yes, the contracts are formed in a way that sort of guarantees money to the investors. So it's almost risk-free. and it falls on the populations or the governments, and that's sort of, if it's not through their water bill, it's through their taxes. So one way or another, people are going to pay for it. So again, it's not a silver bullet. There's a lot of critique of desalination, legitimate critique.
I'll save my other questions for dinner, but
Okay.
there's one last question I'd like to ask you now. This is my last one, okay?
Yeah.
When you did the feasibility study, did you include the carbon footprint of manufacturing the solar panels for the 𝐒𝐞𝐫 water against energy deal? Because the solar panels that are made in China require 33 years of use before their carbon footprint in making them is paid off.
Yeah, I mean, we did look at that. I don't remember if it was 33. That seems like a high number. But yeah, I mean, we were looking at those kind of issues as well. So
We'll take any of the students who's interested in perhaps asking a question.
I said it all, and no more questions left to ask. Yeah?
I think that there's a question over there at the back.
David, you talk about the change in desalination plants. Technologically, can you answer the question simply for me? Contrast and compare, if you will, the early desalination plants with the current ones?
Yeah, so in terms of the technology, there's lots of developments, but most of the early ones were, just to simplify things, to oversimplify it, were basically boiling water and then having it condense, the fresh water, and collecting it, or using electrodes to sort of attract the salts to one side or the other. And that's very expensive and very inefficient. And now, today, almost all of the new desal plants being built are what's called reverse osmosis. So you know osmosis from biology class, if anybody remembers high school biology, of the things dispersing to be evenly spread out in terms of density. Well, this is the reverse. Instead of evenly spreading out, to have something that's evenly spread out and slice it up so that you have really dense and really fresh water. I mean, it's basically just shoving it through a filter under a lot of pressure. And the technology was also very expensive, and then they realized that when it comes out of that filter, it's still under a lot of pressure, and you can reuse that pressure to push it through yet another filter and sort of reduce the costs. And it's been going down sort of precipitously over the last 20 years. And that's now almost all the issues are reverse osmosis, but they're working on other technologies now called forward osmosis and other technologies that are not commercial yet, but that could even reduce costs further. Yeah.
Thank you. Fred Andes. I'm a water lawyer with Barnes & Thornburg in Chicago, and delighted to hear you talk about the 𝐒𝐞𝐵's efforts because I'm co-chair of 𝐒𝐞𝐵's International Advisory Committee. The work that 𝐒𝐞𝐵 is doing to really, and you mentioned their focus on developing healthy interdependencies is really critical in terms of looking at water as an opportunity for work together. And the solar and desalination project is a great example of that, of trying to sort of bring Jordan and Israel together in a way where each has something to gain and something to lose, and they're dependent on each other for important assets. There is, by the way, because this is the first question people always ask me is, well, why isn't the PA included? Why isn't the West Bank or Gaza included? And our answer has been one thing at a time. There are reasons why it's easier governmentally to first do a deal with Jordan, which is moving forward, and then eventually move toward, and already there are discussions about moving forward in terms of doing the same kind of arrangement with the West Bank and Gaza. The other aspect I'll mention is in terms of the issue of private banks and pension funds. One of the things that 𝐒𝐞𝐵 has really been doing has been trying to bring in the development banks, bring in the international development banks, American, EU, and others. And some of the countries like Germany, Japan, Sweden have been incredibly supportive of these efforts. So the hope is that these are really capital-intensive projects. The hope is that the foreign development banks, the international development banks, can play a really strong role in terms of helping to bring the assets in that are needed to make it happen.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, I mean, I obviously know 𝐒𝐞𝐵 well. I was half of the Israeli staff for many years, with the other one being Gidon, the director, the Israeli director. I talk to him on a pretty regular basis. But feel free to also tell him I say. Yeah, we're quite close friends. But one of the first things we did was look at the energy capacity, because I don't have a good background in energy, and I took a postdoc who specializes in energy infrastructure. And there's actually no infrastructure. We have a good map here. There's no good energy infrastructure between Jordan and Israel to get the energy there. And so it would mean developing it. The one connection that they have is between Jordan and Jericho here. And so de facto, if they supply Jericho, they're also supplying Israel, and vice versa, because these are interconnected grids. So politically, it's difficult for the Palestinians to be part of an agreement, but they actually will be part of the agreement, or will be affected by the agreement, whether we call it that or not. This is the one link they have. They're talking about building now more here for this project. But it'll definitely, this will be upgraded. And it might be sort of politically more expedient to not have them part of the agreement. One of the things we did when we were doing the feasibility study was actually look at the project, and the Jordanians especially, but also the Palestinians, were not in favor. Again, this is with a previous government. Were not in favor of these big government-to-government agreements because it was problematic. And when we talked to them about, well, what if it's international and it's not Israel selling desalinated water to Jordan, it's Veolia or Suez or GE or one of these corporations that just happens to be building it here, selling it to. And if it was business to business, that was actually much more acceptable than government to government. And so that was one way we tried to go at it. That's not the way that it actually turned out, but it's certainly one way we tried to get around the political obstacles of moving forward there. Yeah, the international development banks. I know that the World Bank has looked at this favorably. A lot of the money, though, is coming from the UAE. Whether they can access Islamic Development Bank or Arab Development Bank funds, I don't know.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I'm just a student here in the MENA Studies program in journalism.
I'm just a student. I was probably not smart enough to get into this university here. Sell yourself
I mean, sometimes I do question if they made a mistake or not, but that's for me and some other people to figure out. But I really enjoyed it, so thank you. I was wondering if you think this makes countries like Israel more vulnerable, because instead of having a bunch of different natural water supplies, to my understanding, like the desalination plants are specific locations that now are shouldering a lot of the burden of the water supply. So in the event of an attack against Israel or an attack against any of the Palestinian areas that develop this technology, like, doesn't that make them a lot more vulnerable to having their water supply cut off?
Yes. I mean, it is putting a lot of your eggs in a very small number of baskets, because you're so dependent on just a couple of sources, a couple of desalination plants. Right now, Israel has 5. And it's only 5 plants that supply almost 80% of municipal supplies. And obviously, a couple of them are right near Gaza, which is in the news today for conflagration renewed. So it's always a concern. It's a huge concern. One of the things that we were hoping, and we haven't yet seen it really come to fruition, Julie mentioned someone named Alon Tal, who was recently a member of parliament, but he's even more so known as one of the leading environmentalists in Israel, and is also a friend. I just saw him. He came to visit in North Carolina a couple of months ago. He's now in Stanford doing a sabbatical. He's head of public policy at Tel Aviv University. And we wrote an article several years ago saying, this has a real potential, desalination, to rehabilitate Israel's rivers, to allow more water to flow in the rivers, to rehabilitate the aquifers that have been drained, that will provide sort of some kind of resilience for future, to have these reserves back up again. It hasn't happened. I mean, we were sort of naively hopeful that was going to be the case. I mean, it's slowed down the depletion of these aquifers, but because it's so expensive, the government is not sort of eager to spend money. If it's a rainy year, they cut down the amount of desalination rather than using it to sort of replenish aquifers. And it'll take years to replenish all the overdrafts, the decades.
Expensive as technology gets better, or is it
No.
kind of okay?
No. I mean, we haven't seen it. The prices haven't dropped that much, and there's just cost of living increases. So maybe if you take into consideration inflation, yeah, maybe it's gone down a bit, but not much.
Hi, I'm Dana. I'm also just a student. Kind of along the same lines, with this desalination, have you seen that these countries are no longer like investing in other like more natural sustainability water resource management systems, or have they just kind of been relying on this?
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty reliant on this, especially Israel. So I published a study a few years back. Israel came out and started to say, look, desalination, we've solved our water problems, right? And there was a whole book called Let There Be Water that says Israel's now like a water guru, and it's now exporting water, has more water than it knows what to deal with. It's a bunch of rubbish. It's complete rubbish. If you look at Israel's streams, they still have, the Jordan has less than 5% of its natural flow. That's not a country that's overflowing with water. The aquifers are still depleted. That's not a country that's overflowing with water. Not one single coastal stream has more than half of its natural flow, and they're all polluted. That's not a country that has a lot of water. So because you turn on the tap and the water comes out, doesn't mean you've solved your water problems. But in order to sell it to the Israeli population, and the big cost increases that happened, the government said, yeah, we've solved our problems, desalination. And I went to the water authority. I said, you're making a big mistake. You're overselling this. And what happened? I did a survey, and 2/3 of the population said Israel's no longer water scarce. I mean, I showed you the numbers. We're so far below what's considered water scarce by an international standard, and yet people were like, well, we don't have to. And consumption went up. It's a moral hazard issue. People started saying, oh, well, we don't have to. Even during drought periods, when the price was increasing, consumption was going up because we don't have to conserve anymore. So I think it's been a big oversell. And in fact, there was a big campaign afterwards. I published this survey, and usually nobody reads my papers because I'm an academic, and like maybe 5 people do. And that week, I got a call from someone from the Israeli Water Authority saying, I don't think your numbers are true. I said, they're your numbers. And she said, uh-oh. And I said, you've just oversold it. And Israel had an extended drought for the next several years, and then they had a bunch of billboards that said, you know, you have to, every drop is important. This whole campaign that happened like 15 years ago, they renewed it and said, despite desalination, you still have to conserve, because they did oversell it. So it has made them become more complacent, less worried, sort of looking at the technological fix instead of dealing with the more systemic issues and the water conservation issues and the demand management. It's all gone to supply augmentation rather than supply management. Yeah.
My name is Matt Grayson. I'm just a professor. I had a question
I have no respect for that profession.
I had a question about the international law aspect. I was wondering if, in terms of incentivizing desalination plants for the right reason, if there were an international law, like what would be something that could incentivize that, such as a certain if you build a desalination plant, a certain percentage has to go to restoring aquifers, a certain percentage has to go to reducing usage of existing natural resources. What are the sorts of things, and what would it be United Nations? What would be the format under which such an international law could be negotiated and settled?
I don't know, and I don't even want to speak to it because, I don't know enough about international law to really get into the nitty-gritties of that kind of stuff. And also, I don't have a lot of faith in international law to actually move things on the ground in terms of water resource management. But it's sort of above my pay scale. I don't know. It's not my field of specialty, international law. The other thing I'll say is, though, a lot of people are looking at not international water law, but international humanitarian law to make the case that a certain amount needs to go to people at a given price and an affordable price. And so maybe that's what's going to advance it and not water law. But again, it's not really my area of specialty, so sorry. Sorry to bail on that question. Yeah. Oh, yeah, go. Okay.
Also just a student, my apologies for that. I know that this might be a relatively simple, I hope it's not a dumb question. Sorry, thank you, Professor. I'm in our water class here, thank you. And I know this might seem like a simple or like overly dumb question. I'm not an expert here, I'm not a professor.
Well, then we're all going to laugh.
But so you mentioned that the Gaza Strip experiences 30 to 35 meter cube per capita per year, and that seems like, unsustainable amount of acute water scarcity. And you also mentioned that even though they might be able to access the funding for a desalination plant, that there are security concerns. But like, how does Palestine feel about that? And are there any like plans for them to still continue to reduce their, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the word, I'm blanking on it, reduce their water consumption from Israel and have more reliance on their own access?
I mean, really, desalination is really their only option. I mean, they're in a tragic situation, quite honestly. And the international agreement, the Oslo Accords, only allocate a small amount that Israel has to supply Gaza. And the rest, they're on their own. And again, 90-some% of the water is not drinking water quality, according to World Health Organization standard. So that little bit of water that they have is not even useful. And what they're doing is desalinating water with small-scale, very inefficient desalination, just for drinking water purposes. So they're still washing and doing everything else with poor water quality, but for drinking water quality, but it's not regulated, and so you don't really know. You're buying it from a truck or you're buying it from some seller. You don't really know that it's desalinated or good quality. So the situation there is quite tragic. Israel belatedly increased the amount of water that it's supplying to Gaza, but still far below their actual needs. So it's above what's required by the agreement. But again, that agreement was supposed to be a 5-year interim, not a permanent settlement. And so they're trying to move forward. There's something called the Quartet, which is the U.S. and the EU and some other parties, trying to move forward to get this desalination plant up and running. Baby steps, they're making baby steps, and that's really sort of the main plan. Eventually, Gaza would like to expand it and even be exporting water to the West Bank and have it sort of be the water supplier. But that's far off. Right now they don't have enough to meet their even basic needs.
Hi, thank you for wonderfully illuminating presentation. I feel like I know so much more about this than I used to. I'm Nariman Safavi, just a citizen, but a citizen interested in regional solutions for that part of the world especially. And it seems like there is a lot of interdependence of challenges for these countries that they have to deal with, but not enough of an interdependence in collaborative solutions for them. And usually these kinds of things, the collaboration starts happen when some sort of a catastrophe or a crisis precipitates. What kind of, do you see that possibly happening? And you also, in your presentation, you said this should not be viewed as a simple technological silver bullet. What else do we need beyond technological developments to achieve a collaborative and interdependent solution?
Yeah, again, that's a sort of broad question above my pay scale. That's sort of a diplomat. But I think, little trust building issues can help. So there was a project that this organization, 𝐒𝐞𝐸 developed years ago. We wrote a grant for in the 1990s. It was a project that ran for like 20 years. It was called Good Water Neighbors. And it was taking villages, or in some cases towns, on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, or on the Israeli side and the Jordanian side, and pairing them up together so that they could understand that their watersheds are connected and that they're mutually dependent and that they have these common interests, right? So it's not they can stew in their own juices and we don't care, because shooting them is shooting yourself. You spit in the water from which we all drink. And so, these kind of small-scale steps, building trust. I'm working with a group of Dutch and Palestinians to try and improve wastewater issues. It's not really related to this. But you have these wastewater flows that are crossing borders. And the sides don't trust each other and argue over the amount. So having these kind of meters that can report the amounts of wastewater flows and the quality to both sides, that they're both relying on the same meters, is something that we've put forward, rather than having to trust the other side and their numbers and whatnot. They've got an update for me. I don't even know how to turn it up. So, I think small trust-building measures are good. These big sort of agreements, they don't happen often. And even these aren't going to solve the region's water problems. But I think, starting with small-scale issues to build trust between communities, between water users, involving third parties that are sort of trusted, rather than having parties that don't trust each other, don't deal well together, work directly, can be useful. One of the usefulnesses of organizations like 𝐒𝐞𝐈S is sometimes NGOs, non-governmental organizations, can do what governments can't. They can get people together, even if it's just facilitating. They invite governmental people from both sides to an event, and that's their only collaboration, right? So, I think it has to be at the small scale, the bottom up. It is. It's happening less so than it was in the past, just because things are breaking down. But sometimes you see the NGOs sort of pick up slack when government relations go down. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Bianca. I'm a student. Also, thank you for coming and presenting. It was a wonderful presentation. I have a question kind of related to the gentleman's, over there, his previous question on international law, and I know you have limited expertise in that, but I was wondering what's the role of technical experts in updating or potentially updating international water, or as you mentioned, humanitarian law, in order to better water resource management, and where do technical experts enter these conversations, and what can they contribute?
I think I'm editing a book now on technologies and how they're changing international water management, and I'm writing a chapter on water, on desalination. But I'm also working with somebody else. We're writing a chapter on cybersecurity. So there's been a lot of cyber attacks on water systems. When you have all of your water supply in a couple of high-tech industrial facilities that can be easily hacked, you're at risk. And it doesn't take a bomb or sophisticated cutting off a pipeline. Somebody sitting in their pajamas in wherever on the other side of the world can take down your water system. And there's been several attacks, not desalination, but on other water facilities in Israel already. And so, there's the big risk there. But what I was just mentioning about having these water meters, these sensors. So it used to be that countries were dependent on each other for measuring water and reporting statistics. But now you have meters that can report to both sides in real time, online. And so this can be, at least lower the level of mistrust. I won't say build trust, but lower the level of mistrust. It used to be, countries could do whatever they want within their territories and nobody really knew what was going on. But now you have satellite imagery and you can see what's going on. You can sort of measure if a country is taking a lot of water or storing it or damming or building a pipeline. So technology is really changing the way we manage water in quite a number of ways. Yeah.
We have a couple more students. I know that we have about 5 minutes. But I'm Abby. I'm also a student in the Water and Arid Lands course. I had a question. With all the prominence of desalination, do you see a future, or is there already a lot of resource recovery? And what do you of the brine? And what do you think what complexities would that introduce to the geopolitics of desalination?
Yeah, actually, I mean, brine is more of a, at this point, a problem than a resource to be reused. In some cases, you're reusing the brine as part of the desalination process itself, but once you're done with it, mostly it's just being dumped back into the sea, and that's problematic in areas like this that are small, closed gulfs, because it will change the ecosystem of the sea. Right now, there's all sorts of questions. Not only is desalination energy intensive, but it's land intensive, so and it's in coastal areas. But there's also questions about when you keep dumping it back into the sea, is it affecting the marine environment? And right now, it's at a small scale, and it's disperses relatively quickly, so it's very localized effects. But that might change if you're a larger scale. There's actually brackish water in the desert here. One of the issues is what do you do with the brackish water, with the brine? The brine is the leftover water after you desalinate. What do you do with it here? You just dump it back into the desert, and how will that affect ecosystems? So it's more of a problem. I know a bunch of researchers out in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and have been looking at the effect of brine in the Persian Gulf. I shouldn't say that the Arabian Gulf. They use the term the Arabian Gulf. And it's, it is being a factor there. It's affecting the salinity of the overall Gulf, which then the economic viability of desalination. But right now, it's more of a something you have to deal with than a resource, right? A valuable resource. Yeah.
It's actually, so I'm Heather. I'm also a student and a member of the co-work group. And actually one of the things, for some of the student questions, there are, like, Israel is working on other kinds of water, like, resource recovery. Basically in Tel Aviv, there's the Shafdan facility where they're doing soil aquifer treatment, and it's a passive treatment, and then they pump that, like they let it seep into the aquifer and then reuse it for irrigation. So there are like other ways, and also there is technology that like would enable reusing wastewater potentially as potable water. Again, there's like a lot of caveats associated with that, but sorry, what? Yeah, so yeah. So there's other places that do it. So I wondered how, like, why? I mean, there is investment in wastewater treatment and recovery and reuse potentially. And so I wondered, and maybe, I don't know if you have the answer to this, but like, what proportion does desalination versus like wastewater treatment and reuse? Because you cite wastewater as a major issue in desalination and in waterways. So like, if we were to, say, invest more heavily in wastewater reuse, how do you think that would change the, I don't know, the landscape here?
I mean, so these are very related, actually, because Israel is a leader in wastewater reuse. It reuses something like 86% of its water, the last tally I saw, mostly for irrigation purposes. Like Julie said, in Singapore, they call it new water, and it's used for potable waters, for drinking water. But you can only reuse as much as you produce, right? So by having more desalination, we're actually having more wastewater that we can then use for other purposes. So it's actually, every time you desalinate water, you're actually sort of desalinating it like 1.86% because you're going to reuse that later. So it's actually has these knock-on effects. One of the other things is that desalinating has actually increased the quality of our wastewater. So it's lowered the salinity of our wastewater, which is an issue because when you reuse wastewater for agricultural purposes, you want lower salinity. Wastewater is generally higher salinity than fresh water. And so there's a problem of salinating the ground. You can't do it repeatedly or else the crops stop growing. And so having desalinated water has actually improved the quality of our sewage. I mean, that sounds silly to talk about, but it's actually lowered the salinity of our wastewater. So they're very much interrelated.
In 2017, Israel decided after a cost-benefit analysis, Israel became the first country in the world to desalinate its treated wastewater before it reuses it in agriculture. So now all of your treated wastewater is desalinated. So you have the carbon footprint for desalinating water in the first instance, and then you have the carbon footprint for desalinating.
Yeah, Orange County in California does the same thing, actually. They're basically desalinating their wastewater. And then they use it for all purposes after that, including drinking water. So yeah, I mean, it's they're very much related, the desalination and the wastewater. They're not sort of separate issues.
Okay, I think I have just one more question here, and then I'll give it to Elie to close it.
Hi, my name's Evan. So in one of your papers, you wrote about marine pollution as a threat to potable water resources. In terms of like wastewater from Gaza being sent out into the Mediterranean Sea, and then desalination plant in Israel shutting down because it wasn't able to use that water for desalination. If Gaza plans on using desalination as their main water resource in the future, do they also have like a large-scale plan to reduce the amount of wastewater that, like excess wastewater that they have flowing into the Mediterranean Sea, or even in their like natural water resources in Gaza? Because it seems like that's a problem. Do they like have a two-pronged approach here? Because, you know, it seems like if Israel had to shut down a plant miles away, if Gaza tried to have a plant right next to the coast, they would run into a similar issue.
Yeah, okay, so you're the guy who downloaded my paper. Gaza has a plan for upgrading its wastewater treatment facilities, irrespective of desalination. Not because of desalination, but because they want to treat the wastewater, they want to reuse the wastewater. And they have actually made some progress in the last couple of years in doing so in the northern part of Gaza. But yeah, it's obviously a risk for them. But it's not only wastewater, right? So there was, a couple of years ago, there was some mysterious oil blobs that were washing up on the beaches of Israel, and there was a question of whether we were going to have to shut down our desalination plants. It didn't come to pass, but we're developing offshore gas, and that has oil, and there's a question of if there's a problem there, if that would affect the desalination capacity. So they're very much at risk of these seawater issues. But in terms of Gaza, I don't know specifically that they're tying the wastewater to developing the desal. I know that for both of them, they talk about where are we going to have a dedicated energy supply from, because you need for both of them, and that's been an issue for both. But they're being developed mostly, I think, in tandem and not in synchronized or something, as far as I know. But maybe Julie knows better.
𝐂𝐚𝐥, which is the wastewater treatment plant that serves Gaza City, is completely located as far from the coast as you can be in the Gaza Strip, right next to the wall. And they weren't dumping the Gaza sewage in the sea already back in 2017. They were transferring all of the wastewater to 𝐂𝐚𝐥, but 𝐂𝐚𝐥 wasn't functioning for lack of electricity, because all of the electricity that's consumed in the Gaza Strip comes from Israel. And there were no power lines powerful enough to bring enough electricity for 𝐂𝐚𝐥 to function. So the 𝐂𝐚𝐥 treatment plant had been built for 15 years before it started functioning in 2018. And so what they were doing with this wastewater is they were infiltrating it into infiltration ponds as far away from the sea as possible. And it's a sandy aquifer. So the wastewater would progress through the sand towards the sea. And as it was progressing, before it would reach the sea, it was going to reach all of the drinking water wells that supply Gaza City with water, with drinking water. And so that's why there was so much negotiation to bring electricity to 𝐂𝐚𝐥 to function. But in the meantime, to treat this, what they've done is they're pumping this wastewater, untreated wastewater from the ground, using it in irrigation, then pumping it again, using it again in irrigation. Because every time you use it in irrigation, it's equivalent of one treatment, basically. So it's not such good water after 2 uses, but at least once it reaches the drinking water wells in Gaza, you can survive. Now, the water, you correctly said, it's not fit to drink. People have kidney diseases, and teeth are also very badly affected because of the bad quality of the water. But I don't know why, your map was dated 2017, and it showed this wastewater off the coast of Gaza that couldn't come from Gaza City, because in 2017, all of the wastewater from Gaza was being pumped to those infiltration pumps. And I was there. I did the whole field work there for the AFB. So I can really testify that all of the wastewater was pumped as far away from the sea as you could be in the Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that it was coming through Wadi Gaza, it was coming through the river with overflows. I don't know exactly the backstory, but I mean, this is obviously it's satellite data, so you can go back and check it.
The reason for that pollution could be complex, and it would be worth investigating.
Okay, before I formally thank you, David, I would like to say that tomorrow's sessions that begins at 8:30 in the morning will widen the scope. I mean, we focused mostly today on the Israel-Palestine-Jordan situation. We'll continue dealing with that tomorrow, but also expand to other regions in the Middle East and examine the transboundary issues that exist over there. So now to David. I really want to thank you for a phenomenal introductory lecture. Actually, it's not an introductory. You gave us the whole book. And I admire your lecturing ability. My only problem was that at the times you were too slow. But you overcame it quickly. Thank you, David. We couldn't have chosen a better keynote speaker for our conference, and we're looking forward to continue the discussion tomorrow. The speakers are here with us. I haven't introduced them all, but this is to raise your interest to come and join us tomorrow at 8:30, where a light breakfast will be served. So my excellent class, you're superb. You did the homework rightly, but you're also invited to come tomorrow. So if you can make it between classes, you're most welcome. So thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, for a excellent, to join me in thanking the speaker for an excellent opening session. Thank you, David.